Hey there, it's Larry. 100 days of our hair on fire. But you know what? No more hair on fire? Let's get to work. Today, we are going to talk about something that's important to understand when they're dealing with RFK and some of his more bizarre anti-vaxxer ideas. That we need to go back and do a placebo-controlled trial every single vaccine that's currently on the market. A placebo-controlled trial sounds really good, and it's one of the gold standards for experimental designs. But it's not always the right kind of experimental design. The important thing whenever you're doing any kind of experiment is that you have an experimental group where you're trying a new intervention, and you have a control group where the only difference between the two is this one gets the intervention and this one doesn't. A placebo control is one kind of control group. It's not the only kind, and it's also not always the appropriate kind. So let's give an example of a control group. I could say, I'm going to do a video with little girl, and then we're going to do a video without little girl. And I'm going to test both of them and see which one gets the most views. The experiment is having little girl. The control group is not having little girl. And then we see who likes which one better. I'm pretty sure most people are going to like little girl because she's sweet. Yes, she is. Look at her. But that said, I could be wrong, and that's why I have to do an experiment. Now let's talk about why I might use a placebo control. A placebo means something that looks and feels identical to the study intervention. The most common placebo-controlled trials are drug trials, the Viagra trials. We had a blue pill that was Viagra, and there was a fake blue pill that was just a sugar pill that looked like Viagra, but was not really Viagra. Now, why was it important to use a placebo control? Because we got some interesting findings in the Viagra trials. It was shown that when you looked at the experimental group with the real Viagra versus the placebo group with the fake Viagra, erectile function improved in the experimental group. But you know what else happened? Erectile function also improved in the placebo group, just not as much. And we could measure that difference between the control group and the experimental group. And we could measure the difference between the control group and the baseline. This suggested to us that there were probably two components to erectile dysfunction improvement. Some of it was physiologic, the improving blood flow, that sort of thing. The other part was probably psychologic, that people had, for whatever reason, some sort of anxiety component that affected their erectile function. Otherwise, they should have had zero improvement in the control group. But they believed in this placebo medication and thought it might be real, and so their erectile function improved. So it's important that we have a control group, because even if we see a change from baseline, we don't know if that change is really due to the drug. So let's now consider when I might use a placebo. I use a placebo when I have nothing else. If I was going to test, say, a vaccine against polio, and I had no vaccine to fight polio at all, no treatments for polio, nothing. In that instance, a placebo-controlled trial makes sense, because you need a control group to be sure that the change you're seeing is real and not just a function of random fluctuations. Let's talk about the COVID vaccines, because this was much more recent, and experimental designs have improved a lot since the polio vaccine. Now, when we introduced the COVID vaccine and had nothing else to test it against, the first vaccine, Pfizer, what did we do? We used a placebo control because there was no other vaccine. So what we wanted to know was we had the real vaccine and we had the placebo, and what happened to rates of COVID. And it turned out that the real vaccine was very effective at preventing life-threatening COVID, whereas the placebo did not. And the rates did not change from the baseline that we measured before we had any vaccine at all. So then what happens? We've got the Pfizer vaccine on the market. Great. Now we've got a second vaccine that we want to test to see how well it does at fighting COVID. Is it ethical now, when we have an effective vaccine, to use a placebo to test a new vaccine? We could test it against a placebo with all the risks in this control group of people dying or getting very sick or getting long COVID. But what we did is a different kind of trial. Is this new treatment better or worse than the existing treatment? After the Pfizer vaccine was already approved, in my control group, I would get the Pfizer vaccine. And probably what I'd see is that both vaccines were highly effective. And it turned out the vaccine performed well enough and far above baseline that we said, let's go ahead and approve that vaccine as well. Let's review the important points. In any experiment, you have a control because you need to know whether the thing that you're experimenting with is causing the change, or is it just random fluctuations in the population that have nothing to do with the difference between the experiment and the control. When you have no other alternative, your control can be a placebo, like a sugar pill that doesn't do anything. And that's fine because you can measure the difference essentially between your vaccine and nothing. If you have something that's effective, like we did when we had the second COVID vaccine coming out and the first were already approved, is use the prior vaccine as your control and see how much better or worse the new experimental vaccine does. That's the way you do this ethically. Because once you've got a treatment for something that's life-threatening, it is not ethical to do a placebo-controlled trial because then people are at risk of serious illness or death. That is completely unnecessary.